Wang Yangming was a 16th century philosopher, known most notably for his discussions on morality, on knowledge of good and evil. And here we are to examine a passage of the Chuanshilu record of, well, we could say the transmission of learning. Now, Wang Yangming is an interpreter of so-called Chinese classics, so the so-called Confucian tradition, scholarship. But most importantly, as an interpreter of that tradition, he brings our attention to its roots, the roots of that tradition in the constituents of reality. Reality that is not by any means reducible to our experience of things. Our experience of things is something that can obscure reality. Now, there is a path, as we shall see. Wang Yangming refers to a path of learning. That path of learning is not good or evil. It cannot be attributed anything bad. However, it can be corrupted, it can be lost, it can be obscured. And as we depart from genuine learning, we turn to evil. And that obviously is a problem that Wang Yangming is aware of, that he is addressing, that he is warning us against. But let us move to the passage that is drawn from the Chuanshilu and see what Wang Yangming has to say. Now, one of the conclusions we might be tempted to reach as we approach Wang Yangming's text is that, well, morality, good and evil, is all relative, is all subjective, as we are apt to have heard in our times. Now, while Wang Yangming is not saying that whether something is good or bad or evil is constitutive of things, neither is he saying that good and evil is a matter of, well, points of view. What does he say? Well, Ruzhong, we're looking at somebody citing the Xiansheng, the teacher, and he's citing him to the effect that 无善无恶是心之体. The absence of good and evil, both of them, characterize the substance of the mind, 心之体. 有善有恶, whereas the presence of evil and of good and evil is in the 意志动. That would be the movement of the will. However, there is such a thing as knowledge of good and evil, 知善知恶, and that is what Wang Yangming is calling 良知. 良知 is a kind of, well, obviously as knowledge of good and evil, we could call this moral knowledge. In fact, 良 is also pure, good. We could even justifiably refer to this as philosophical knowledge or practical philosophy. Yeah? 伪上去是得物. And now this knowledge, this moral knowledge, or this knowledge of good and evil, yeah? We can think about knowledge of good and evil in biblical terms. But this knowledge is now associated with the ordering of things, 格物. The ordering of things involves an proceeding toward the good and a discarding of evil. Now, it turns out that this ordering of things is what human life, properly speaking, is all about. 德宏曰, but then the Hong says, well, but what about this will? 如何? How is this? How is this will that we're talking about, this intention of the mind? You know? 义. 儒中曰, and the answer there was that, in fact, we have not exhausted the subject matter. We just gave a heading there. Now, if we say that the substance of the mind, 形体, 是无上无恶, is devoid of good and evil, then the will as well is devoid of good and evil, or rather is a will devoid of good and evil, as opposed to a will that is fallen into good and evil, or into a predicament where it is either good or evil. But then, in the former case, so where the will is understood as devoid of good and evil, for it depends upon the substance of the mind, as an extension of sorts, then knowledge also will be a knowledge devoid of good and evil. And then the objects of knowledge, so will also be things that are devoid of good and evil. We could say that, philosophically speaking, nothing is good or evil. And yet, we are not to understand by this that Wang Yangming is calling for a value versus facts distinction that we are used to learning about. What are these things? The object of knowledge turns out to be not a fact, an empirical fact, but something more fundamental than that. Now, 若说亦有善恶, if we say that there is good and evil in the will, 毕竟形体, finally the substance of the mind will have to go back to good and, or revolve into good and evil. So the will, insofar as it stems from the substance of the mind, must be devoid of good and evil. Now, De Hongyue response, or rather, here is the statement that is offered. And it says that the substance of the mind is, we could say, 天命之心, the essence of, essentially, we're dealing with authority, 天命, the mandate of heaven. So the essence of authority is the substance of the mind. 原是无善无恶的. It is originally devoid of good and evil. So we could say that 天命, authority, deals with good and evil. 当然有喜心呢. But man has a learning mind. Men are learning, and there is good and evil. Where is good and evil? It is in the 一念上将. It is, in fact, in the views that, and the conceptions that we adhere to. Now, we could say, colloquially speaking, our ideas can be good or bad. In fact, our concepts, the concepts that we attribute to things, perhaps, that we see things in, can be good or not. We move on and read that the 格致成正修. Now, these various aspects of our life, the life of learning, the ordering, attaining, verifying, correcting, and amending. Well, all of these are, properly speaking, the discipline of reverting to the essence mentioned above. The essence in itself. So that the alternative to remaining lost between good and evil is none other than this path of learning, of discipline, through which we order, or rather there is ordering, attainment, verification, correction, and emendation of, well, precisely those views, 一念上将, the conceptions that things come with in our experience, in our ordinary experience. What we experience is never a fact in and of itself, a valueless fact, but a fact that is conceived, insofar as it is conceived, something that has happened, a content of experience that is informed conceptually. And this package of content and form can be evaluated, can be ordered, can be brought to its limits, can be verified, can be corrected, and, well, alternatives. We can come up with alternatives, better alternatives. Now, if originally there is no good and evil, then needless to say, he adds, neither is there any in our discipline. So now we see that there is such a thing as knowledge of good and evil, that good and evil is not merely a matter of values, subjective values that we attribute to things, even though things in themselves are devoid of the distinction. So what does good and evil pertain to? It pertains to the manner in which the human being lives. You can be good or evil. That is clear. To the extent that you are learning, you are ordering your life, or your life is being ordered, corrected. There are good things happening. There is a verification of authority. Your life is turning toward the good, discarding evil. What does this mean? Well, it means that your life is properly human. Now, properly human life is a life that returns all things to the substance of the mind in itself, as we have seen. The life that departs from the substance of the mind in itself, and so the foundations of authority of the Yangming, is a bad life. The question of good and evil, therefore, is not one that pertains to attributions of good or evil, to things, to reality. The mind in itself transcends the distinction. But in fact, the will itself transcends the distinction. Our intentions transcend the distinction between good and evil insofar as they point back to the ground of good and evil. So when we're speaking about good and evil, we're also speaking about, or at once speaking about, the problem of authority. What is right and wrong, for that matter? Our mandate as human beings. That mandate is well grounded in the very nature of the mind. Now elsewhere, and perhaps we'll explore this point in a future video, elsewhere Wang Yangming refers to the mind as being not a subjective quality, to speak in modern terms. He refers to it as the mind of the universe. One might associate this manner of speech to a certain ancient Stoic discourse on the anima mundi, the soul of the world. But we need not go far with this association. It is enough to understand that for Wang Yangming, in other words, this is what he is pointing out for us, our mind is none other than the mind of things themselves, of the universe, of all things. So that there is a single mind. If we are to abstract our mind and conceive of it as something devoid of world, something that has the world as its counterpart, we remain alienated and fail to understand the genuine nature of mind. But perhaps a further discussion on this will come about, will be propitious, will be helpful. For now, it was important to stress that in Wang Yangming there is no moral relativism, and yet at the same time no what we could call moral dogmatism. And the way you avert both poles is by investigating the root of human life and the root of authority of the Tianming, and to order your life in the direction of that root in itself, to the extent that we order our lives back to that source of order and of authority, really. We are good to the extent that we are distracted from that center, from that origin, and are led astray by, well, phenomena, you know, that are mutually conditioning and conditioned and are not primordial, that, well, to that extent, we fall into evil. That is a lesson from Wang Yangming.